This is Jed Distler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I'm going to introduce this episode with a quote from a well-known letter that was written by a well-known composer. Here's the quote. It goes like this. Last summer, I found in a Paris gramophone shop the records of Conlon Nancarrow's music, volumes 1 and 2. I listened and became immediately enthusiastic. This music is the greatest discovery since Webern and Ives, something great and important for all of music history. His music is so utterly original, enjoyable, perfectly constructed, but at the same time emotional. For me, it's the best of any composer living today. That was a letter written by the composer György Ligeti to Charles Amerkanian, who also is a composer and who produced the first integral recordings made of the studies for player piano by Conlon Nancarrow. Conlon Nancarrow was an American composer who became frustrated with the inability of musicians to perform his rhythmically complex scores accurately. So he hit upon the idea of creating music for player piano, where he could punch his own piano rolls to ensure the most precise results he could desire. And this also allowed him to explore tempos and rhythmic complexities far beyond what two human hands could play in real time. Many of Nancarrow's earlier player piano studies are jazz-influenced. For example, the Boogie Woogie Suite, which is study number 3. The first time I heard this, it reminded me of a boogie woogie pianist like Albert Ammons trapped in the body of Cecil Taylor. And many of Nancarrow's later studies are canons that are constructed in ratios that involve irrational numbers. For example, rather than having a canon and an imitative voice moving in the same tempo as the original voice, or at a ratio that's twice as fast or twice as slow, like augmentation or diminution, Nancarrow will have irrational proportions. And with a player piano handy and his own custom-made piano roll cutter, Conlon Nancarrow could execute these proportions with the utmost precision. Yet beneath the surface rigor of Nancarrow's compositional strategies, there's always a playful side. For instance, you'll hear what seems to be dry and arguably academic-sounding two-part dissonant counterpoint suddenly break out into the fastest arpeggiated figurations in the West, or it'll break out into hyperactive repeated chords that just hammer away until you beg for mercy. The study number 20, for instance, explores repeated notes in circumscribed ranges. And then there's this piece called Canon X, where two voices respectively slow down and speed up, crossing in the middle. One especially memorable study is the study number 25, which is a veritable orgy of supersonic glissandos, chords, and asymmetrical patterns that all culminate in this cataclysmic coda where 1,012 notes are played in 12 seconds with the sustain pedal slammed down. It's kind of amazing to hear this, and obviously no two human hands can do that. So as you can see, this music is undoubtedly original, and I think it's endlessly fascinating. My first encounter with the Conlon Nancarrow player piano studies was on a Columbia Masterworks LP that came out, I think, in 1968, and it had selected studies that were recorded in Conlon Nancarrow's own Mexico City studio on his own player pianos. Then in 1988, Charles Amarkanian went to Mexico City to make digital recordings for all of Nancarrow's studies, and these were released on the Vergo label. But the only problem was that one of Nancarrow's 2 player pianos was in disrepair, so only one of these instruments could be used. So for the studies involving 2 pianos, they had to resort to overdubbing. However, a decade earlier, in 1977, Amarkanian had visited Nancarrow in Mexico City, and at that time he made analog recordings of studies numbers 1 through 41, which were all that existed at that time. And these were all issued on 4 LPs on the 1750 Arch label between 1977 and 1984. These were the LPs that Ligeti was talking about in that letter earlier on. But what's really important about these analog recordings is that they used both of Nancarrow's instruments, and they have the advantage of each piano's distinct timbre. For instance, one of the pianos had metal-covered felt hammers, and the other piano had leather strips on the hammers. I personally prefer these analog recordings over the digital remakes, mainly because the sonics convey an immediacy and a bite that I think is a little bit lacking in the drier yet possibly more realistic ambience of the digital recordings. And also, the analog recordings employed generally faster tempos. The 1750 Arch analog recordings eventually were released on CD in a box set on the Other Minds label, and I've posted links in my episode description to both the Other Minds release and the Vergo release. There's still is another edition out there of the Nancarrow Studies for Player Piano that was issued on the MDG label. And these recordings are different because they play the rolls back on a Bosendorfer grand piano fitted with an Ampico player piano mechanism whose hammers were modified with leather strips and metal parts according to Nancarrow's direct specifications. So this way you get the percussive clarity of Nancarrow's own instruments, but you also get the sonorous and resonant advantages of a first-rate concert grand, as opposed to Nancarrow's 2 upright pianos. Also, the MDG recordings were made in a resonant church acoustic that offers a totally different ambience than the close microphone placement and the dry acoustic of Nancarrow's home studio in Mexico City. Personally, I think the wiry, almost harpsichord-like sound that emits from certain registers on Nancarrow's uprights have more timbral diversity than what hears from the more evenly regulated Bösendorfer Grand. And there's more bite and edge to the closer microphone placement in the Charles Amarkanian recordings, especially the 1977 analog sessions. But on the other hand, the Bosendorfer's tuning proves to be more reliable and sturdy. The bottom line is that the MDG series on a Bosendorfer and the Other Minds and Vergo recordings on Nancarrow's own upright player pianos complement one another. And so I'd advise you to try to sample all of these recordings, and then you can draw your own conclusions and make your own preferences. But whatever you do, do not miss out on experiencing Conlon Nancarrow's Studies for Player Piano. They add up to what I consider to be one of the most significant bodies of keyboard work of the 20th century. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And I envy you hearing Conlon Nancarrow's player piano studies for the first time. I just love these pieces, so I hope you'll check them out. And I hope you will be with me for the next episode. I look forward to being together. Take care.